A clay tablet no bigger than a paperback book sits in a museum collection in the Middle East, pressed from river mud and fired somewhere around 4,000 years ago. On it, in a neat wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, is a story. And the story begins not with humanity's glory, but with our purpose. According to the people who wrote it, we were not born. We were manufactured. We were made to work so that more powerful beings would not have to. That is not a fringe theory someone posted online last week. That is what the tablet says. And once you sit with that for a moment, once you let the weight of those 4,000 years settle, the question it raises does not go away easily. Were the ancient Sumerians recording history, mythology, or something stranger than either? That is the journey we are taking today, and I promise you, the deeper we go into these texts, the stranger it gets. Let me set the scene first, because the Sumerians deserve a proper introduction. They are, by most scholarly reckoning, the architects of the world's first recognizable urban civilization. We are talking about southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is today southern Iraq. By roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, they had built cities, not camps, not villages, walled cities with administrative centers, irrigation canals, professional armies, courts of law, and something that would change humanity forever: a writing system. Cuneiform began as a bookkeeping tool, which is very on-brand for civilization. No one, it turns out, has ever managed to build a city without first figuring out how to track grain deliveries. But it grew into something extraordinary: poetry, hymns, legal codes, and creation myths. Thousands of tablets have been recovered from the ruins of Sumerian and later Babylonian cities, Nippur, Ur, Eridu, Nineveh, and what those tablets describe about the origins of human beings is unlike anything you were taught in school. The city of Nippur alone yielded tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets when excavations began there in the 1880s under the direction of the University of Pennsylvania. Many of those tablets are still being translated and analyzed today, sitting in the collections of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, their contents slowly yielding secrets to a small community of scholars who can read a script that died as a living language roughly 2,000 years ago. The sheer volume of textual material the Sumerians left behind is staggering, and it tells us that whatever these people believed about their origins, they believed it deeply enough to write it down over and over across many centuries. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about something, because you deserve that. The Sumerian texts come to us through layers of interpretation, translation, and scholarly debate. Some of what I am going to describe is broadly agreed upon by academic historians and philologists, scholars who spend their careers reading cuneiform. Some of it is the subject of genuine academic disagreement, and some of it lives in the territory where mainstream scholarship ends and more speculative interpretation begins. I will tell you clearly which is which, because the real story is compelling enough on its own. We do not need to dress it up. The text at the center of everything is called the Atrahasis Epic. It is a Babylonian composition written in the Akkadian language, but scholars broadly agree it draws on much older Sumerian source material that was already ancient when Babylon was young. The version that survives most completely dates to roughly the 17th century before the Common Era, though fragments suggest earlier versions existed. The story it tells goes like this. In the beginning, there were the gods, a ruling class of divine beings called the Anunnaki, a name that in Sumerian roughly means those of noble descent, or by some translations, those who came from the heavens to the earth. Below them was a second tier of divine laborers called the Igigi, and the Igigi had a job. They dug the rivers, they moved the earth, they built the irrigation channels, they did, in short, all the back-breaking physical labor that kept the divine world running, and they did it for a very, very long time. The tablets are specific about how long. By some accounts in the text, the Igigi labored for 40 periods, The exact translation of the time unit is debated, but the point is unmistakable. It was an eternity, and eventually, as laborers throughout history have always done when pushed past their limit, they had enough. The Atrahasis Epic describes a divine labor strike. The Igigi throw down their tools, they burn their work implements, they march to the house of the chief god, Enlil, in the middle of the night, and they demand relief. What happens next is the part that catches your breath. The gods do not send the strikers back to work. Instead, they hold a council, and the solution they arrive at, proposed by the god of wisdom and water, a deity named Enki, one of the most fascinating figures in all of ancient mythology, is to create a new being, a being capable of doing the labor, a being that can bear the yoke so the Igigi no longer have to. They call this new creation the Lulu. In Sumerian, the word means something close to the mixed one or the primitive one, and the Lulu is made, according to the text, from clay mixed with the blood, or in some translations, the flesh and intelligence of a slain divine being. A god is sacrificed. That divine essence is combined with earth, and from that mixture, humanity is formed. The god who is sacrificed in the Atrahasis account is named We-Ila, a minor deity among the Anunnaki, chosen specifically, the text implies, because he possessed what the Akkadian calls temu, a word scholars translate variously as reason, personality, or spirit. It is his temu, his inner animating intelligence, that is transferred into the clay mixture. This is not incidental detail. The Sumerians were making a very specific claim, that what separates humans from ordinary animals is not our bodies, which are made of earth like everything else, but a spark of something that once belonged to a more powerful order of being. That idea, divine intelligence lodged inside a mortal frame, will echo through every major religious tradition that follows. Let that land for a second. The oldest, detailed creation story we have, older than Genesis, older than any text in the Hebrew Bible by at least 1,000 years, possibly more, describes human beings as a workforce created to relieve more powerful beings of labor they no longer wished to do. We were not the crown jewel of creation. We were the solution to a staffing problem. I want to be precise here. Mainstream scholars read this as mythology, as a poetic explanation for why human life involves toil and suffering, a theological answer to the very human question of why existence is so hard. That is a completely reasonable reading, but it is also worth noting that the Sumerians themselves do not seem to have treated these texts as pure allegory in the way we might treat Aesop's fables. They appear to have believed, on some level, that these events had actually occurred. The line between mythology and history was not drawn the same way in Sumer as it is in a modern university. Now here is where it gets even more interesting, and where the threads start connecting across cultures in a way that is hard to dismiss. The Atrahasis Epic does not end with creation. It continues. The humans multiply. They become numerous and loud. The text specifically mentions their noise disturbing the god Enlil's sleep, which is either a wonderful piece of ancient humor or a deeply unsettling comment on how the gods viewed their creation. Enlil, annoyed and perhaps alarmed by the growing human population, decides to thin the herd. He sends plagues, then drought, then famine. Each time, Enki quietly tips off a righteous man, a man named Atrahasis, on how to survive, and then Enlil brings the flood, a world-ending deluge designed to wipe out humanity entirely. Enki, again working around Enlil's decree through what you can only describe as divine loophole exploitation, warns Atrahasis to build a boat, to take aboard the seed of all living things, and to wait out the storm. The flood comes. The world is submerged. Atrahasis and his cargo survive, and when the waters recede, the gods, who had not actually thought through the consequences of eliminating the beings who made their offerings and did their work, are relieved to find him alive. If that story sounds familiar, it should. The parallels to the later Genesis flood narrative, Noah, the ark, the animals, the divine decision to spare one righteous man, are not coincidental. Scholars have documented the connections extensively. The Sumerian flood story also appears in an earlier standalone text known as the Eridu Genesis, and it surfaces again in one of the greatest literary works of the ancient world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a flood survivor named Utnapishtim tells his story to the wandering king. The Genesis account, as best as historians can reconstruct the timeline, was written down centuries after these Mesopotamian versions were already circulating. What we are looking at is not two independent stories arriving at the same myth by coincidence. We are looking at a tradition, a deep cultural memory of a catastrophic flood, being passed from civilization to civilization through trade, conquest, and the movement of peoples across the ancient Near East. Whether that memory points to a real historical event, and there are geologists who think it might, pointing to events like the rapid flooding of the Black Sea basin in the distant past, or whether it is purely symbolic, the transmission itself is one of the most remarkable stories in intellectual history. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, put forward in 1997 by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University, proposed that around 5600 BCE, a catastrophic breach of the Bosphorus allowed Mediterranean seawater to pour into what had been a smaller, freshwater lake, raising its level by hundreds of feet and submerging thousands of square miles of previously inhabited coastline within a matter of months. The human populations living around that lake would have scattered in every direction, carrying the memory of a world drowned by rising water. Whether that specific event is the seed of the Sumerian flood myth cannot be proven, but the timeline overlaps with the earliest strata of Mesopotamian civilization in a way that serious researchers consider worth examining. Now I want to take a step sideways and talk about someone whose name you have almost certainly heard if you have spent any time in the ancient mysteries space: Zecharia Sitchin. In a series of books beginning in the 1970s, Sitchin proposed a radical reading of the Sumerian texts. He argued that the Anunnaki were not mythological gods, but literal extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago from a planet in our solar system he called Nibiru. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these beings needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. They came to Earth to mine it. Their workers revolted, and they genetically engineered Homo sapiens, mixing their own DNA with that of existing hominids, to serve as a slave labor force. The creation of the Lulu, in Sitchin's reading, was not metaphor. It was a genetic engineering project, and the blood of the sacrificed god, in the Atrahasis myth, represented the injection of extraterrestrial DNA into early humans. Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. His ideas are genuinely thrilling to contemplate, and I think it is important to treat them fairly rather than simply dismissing them, because the honest answer is more nuanced than either total acceptance or total rejection. Here is the problem, stated plainly. Mainstream scholars of Assyriology, the academic discipline devoted to Mesopotamian languages and texts, have largely rejected Sitchin's translations as inaccurate. He was, in the view of many specialists, reading things into the cuneiform that are simply not there, sometimes translating words in ways that conflict with how those words are used everywhere else in the corpus of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The planet Nibiru does appear in ancient texts, but most scholars interpret it as a name for Jupiter or for a particular celestial position, not as a rogue planet on a massive elliptical orbit. And there is, to be blunt, no archaeological or geological evidence for the presence of an extraterrestrial mining civilization on Earth in the distant past. Assyriologist Michael S. Heiser, who spent years specifically analyzing Sitchin's translations before his death in 2022, documented dozens of cases where Sitchin assigned meanings to Sumerian and Akkadian words that have no support in the established lexicons built by the academic community over more than a century of scholarship. Heiser was not dismissive of the texts themselves. He found them genuinely fascinating, but he was precise about where Sitchin's framework departed from what the tablets actually say. That distinction matters because it allows us to engage seriously with what the texts do say without being misled about what they do not. But here is what I find genuinely worth sitting with. Sitchin arrived at his interpretation precisely because the Sumerian texts really do describe the creation of humans as a deliberate act by more powerful beings. He did not invent that. That is in the tablets. He interpreted it in a particular direction, a very literal, very science fiction direction. But the kernel that fascinated him is real. The Sumerians genuinely did describe humans as created beings with a purpose assigned to them by others. That is not Sitchin's invention. That is the text. And then there is the science. Not because I want to suggest the extraterrestrial hypothesis is proven, it is not, but because the question of human origins has its own genuine mysteries, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in the fossil record involves what some researchers describe as a surprisingly compressed timeline when you compare our cognitive and behavioral complexity to our closest evolutionary relatives. The gap in symbolic thinking, language complexity, and cultural sophistication between Homo sapiens and other hominid species is, by any measure, striking. There are ongoing, legitimate scientific debates about the pace and mechanism of human cognitive evolution that are not fully resolved. Mainstream evolutionary biology has well-developed models for how this happened through natural selection. But it is worth acknowledging, as some researchers openly do, that the picture is not completely tidy. I am not telling you this to validate the ancient astronaut hypothesis. I am telling you this because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging genuine uncertainty, and because the Sumerians asking the question, where did we come from and why are we the way we are, is not a question that even modern science has fully answered. What geneticists have confirmed is that the human lineage experienced at least one significant population bottleneck, a period when the total number of breeding humans may have dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals, possibly around 70,000 years ago during the aftermath of the Toba supervolcano eruption in what is now Sumatra. The species came extraordinarily close to extinction. And then, relatively rapidly in evolutionary terms, something changed. The archaeological record shows a flowering of symbolic behavior, beads, ochre pigment, engraved geometric patterns, beginning roughly 50,000 years ago in sites from South Africa to Europe. Paleoanthropologists call it the behavioral modernity transition. What triggered it is still debated. The Sumerians, for their part, had their own answer. Let me bring in one more figure from the Sumerian texts, because he is central to this whole story, and he rarely gets the attention he deserves. Enki. In the mythological framework of the Sumerians, Enki, who the Babylonians would later call Ea, is the god of wisdom, fresh water, crafts, magic, and creation. He is the one who actually fashions the first human beings, working with the birth goddess, Ninhursag. He is the one who repeatedly warns humanity when Enlil decides to destroy it. He is a trickster figure in the most profound sense, not malicious, but clever, operating through indirection and wit, always finding the way around the absolute decree. If you wanted to look for a figure in the ancient Near East who embodies the idea of a creator with genuine affection for his creation, who treats humans as more than just a workforce, who works to preserve humanity even against the will of the more powerful gods, that figure is Enki, and his presence in the texts complicates the simple reading of humans as slaves in a beautiful way. Even within the mythology's own internal logic, the experiment, if we want to call it that, took on a life of its own. The created beings turned out to be more than what they were designed for. They told stories, they built temples, they wrote songs. They asked, 4,000 years ago, the very questions we are still asking today. Enki's temple at Eridu, which many Sumerian texts identify as the oldest city, the first place of civilization, was called the E-Abzu, meaning House of the Abzu, the Abzu being the primordial underground freshwater ocean over which Enki presided. Eridu itself, now an archaeological site in southern Iraq, designated Tel Abu Shahrain, shows continuous occupation going back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the earliest confirmed urban settlements on Earth. When archaeologists excavated it in the 1940s and 1950s, they found 18 successive temples built one atop another on the same sacred spot, each generation rebuilding what the last had left. That kind of continuity across thousands of years speaks to a people who took their relationship with the divine very seriously indeed. There is something in the Gilgamesh epic that I keep returning to when I think about all of this. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. The text is very specific about this unusual ratio, which is itself a fascinating detail. And the whole arc of the epic is his search for immortality after the death of his closest companion. He travels to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one human granted eternal life. And Utnapishtim tells him there is a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives for it, he gets it, and then a serpent steals it while he sleeps. He returns home, empty-handed. The epic ends not with transcendence, but with Gilgamesh standing at the walls of his city, Uruk, and pointing out to his ferrymen everything humanity has built. Look at the walls, the text says. Look at what we made. The monument to human effort is the answer to mortality, not an escape from it. I find that extraordinarily moving from a document nearly 4,000 years old. Whatever the Sumerians believed about our origins, however they understood the relationship between humanity and those who made them, they also understood that what we do here, what we build and love and mourn, matters. Uruk itself, the city Gilgamesh ruled, was by around 3100 BCE the largest city on Earth, home to an estimated 50,000 people and covering an area of approximately 6 square kilometers enclosed by walls. The Greek historian Herodotus would later describe the walls of Babylon in odd terms, but Uruk's walls were already ancient by Babylon's golden age. Archaeologists excavating Uruk in the early 20th century found the earliest examples of pictographic writing there, the direct ancestor of cuneiform, pressed into clay accounting tablets that recorded transactions in beer and grain. The city that gave us the world's first great work of literature also gave us the world's first written records. That combination, epic poetry and grain receipts in the same archive, tells you everything about the complexity of Sumerian civilization. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you know this is exactly the kind of rabbit hole we love to go down together. The questions that refuse to close neatly, the ancient documents that say things no one expected them to say. If you are not subscribed yet, this would be a wonderful moment to join us. There are thousands of years of mystery left to explore, and every week we find another thread worth pulling. Hit subscribe and come along for the ride. And now, back to those clay tablets. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, and I want to be straightforward that this is my own reflection, rather than something I can claim as established fact. The Sumerians were not simple people. They were the inventors of the wheel, of the first written legal code, of systematic astronomy, of literature. When they sat down to explain where human beings came from, they arrived at a story in which we are deliberately created, given intelligence mixed with something divine, set to work, and then watched over by beings who alternately found us useful, found us irritating, and occasionally cared for us deeply. That story has echoes everywhere. It echoes in Genesis, where humans are formed from dust and given the breath of God, placed in a garden with a purpose, and eventually cast out to labor. It echoes in the myths of the Mayas, where the Popol Vuh describes several failed attempts to create humanity before the gods got it right. It echoes in the Hindu Puranas, in the ancient Egyptian texts, in the oral traditions of cultures on every continent, where the story of a divine creator shaping human beings from earth and breath shows up again and again with a consistency that is either the result of shared human psychology or something more mysterious? The Popol Vuh is worth pausing on for just a moment, because the parallel is remarkably specific. In that Quiché Maya text, preserved in writing after Spanish colonization, but drawing on traditions that predate European contact, the creator gods Tepeu and Gukumats first try to make humans from mud, but the mud creatures dissolve and cannot speak properly. Then they try wood, but the wooden people have no memory and no souls and are eventually destroyed in a flood sent by the gods. Only on the third attempt, fashioning people from maize, do the creators succeed. 3 attempts to get the recipe right. The Atrahasis Epic shows the gods adjusting their methods across multiple catastrophes. The Popol Vuh shows creators iterating through failed prototypes. The conceptual framework, deliberate creation by more powerful beings, early failures, refinement, appears independently on opposite sides of the Atlantic, in civilizations with no confirmed contact. That is the kind of convergence that keeps researchers up at night. I am not going to tell you which it is. I genuinely do not know, and I am suspicious of anyone who claims to. The honest position is that we have a body of ancient texts, written by some of the most sophisticated people who ever lived, that describe human origins in ways that are troubling, poetic, strange, and strangely specific. They do not read like fairy tales designed for children. They read like records written by people who believed they were describing something real. Whether that reality was literal, metaphorical, or something that does not fit neatly into either of those modern categories, that is the question the tablets keep asking. What I find most striking, sitting with all of this, is not the extraterrestrial angle or the genetic engineering theory. What strikes me is the question embedded in the Sumerian creation narrative that the Sumerians themselves do not fully answer. If we were created for a purpose, what happens when we outlive that purpose? What happens when the gods who needed labor no longer need us? The Atrahasis Epic suggests Enlil's answer was the flood, but Enki's answer, and the answer the story ultimately endorses, is that humanity has value beyond its original function. We became something the gods did not entirely plan for. That unplanned something, that excess of being beyond mere usefulness, is what every library, every cathedral, every painting on a cave wall represents. Whatever we are, we became more than a labor force, and a clay tablet, written 4,000 years ago, in a language almost no one alive can read, seems to understand that about us. The question worth leaving you with is this. Does it matter, practically, whether the Sumerian creation myth is literally true, metaphorically true, or the remnant of something that actually happened and has been garbled by 4,000 years of retelling? I think it does matter, not because it changes who we are tomorrow, but because of what it says about the depth of the question itself. Human beings have been asking where we came from and why we are here for as long as we have been writing things down. Probably longer. The Sumerians had an answer. It was uncomfortable, and it was complicated, and it featured a god who cared enough to warn one man to build a boat. That combination of uncomfortable origin and unexpected grace feels, honestly, very human. Maybe because it was written by humans, maybe for other reasons. You get to decide. If this story left you with a question you cannot shake, which I hope it did, I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think the Sumerian creation texts are mythology, cultural memory, or something that points toward a stranger truth? Tell me what you think, because this community genuinely has some of the most thoughtful takes I have ever read, and I read every one. If you want to keep pulling this thread, our next video goes deep into the Anunnaki themselves, who they were, what the texts say about them across different Mesopotamian periods, and why their story refuses to stay in the past, where scholars would prefer it to remain. That one is coming up next, and if you are not subscribed yet, please do. We have a long list of mysteries ahead of us, and I would love to have you with us for every one of them. Until next time, thank you for being curious. It is the best thing a person can be.